energy is infinite. But what if you have to pay for it?
Critical failure. System failure. Evacuate.
We need to shut it down, now!
We hear you. We see you.
We're here.
The ArcLight facility was a secret in the purest sense. No records, no official funding, no existence outside of the minds of those working within its frozen halls. Buried deep beneath the Arctic ice, it was the kind of place where scientific ambition outpaced regulation, where necessity justified risk. Dr. Lenora Vance had fought for years to bring her vision to life, a vision that promised to end the world's reliance on dwindling fossil fuels. Nuclear fusion had proved too volatile, quantum batteries too inefficient. But there was one resource that had never been tapped, one potential energy source that defied conventional physics. Parallel realities. The Rift reactor had been an impossible dream until now. Based on decades of fringe research and black-budget experimentation, it was designed to create a controlled breach between dimensions, to siphon raw energy from another version of existence itself. The calculations were solid. The model worked on small scales. They had tested it, refined it, and simulated every variable. The risks were accounted for, until the day they turned it on. The core chamber was bathed in sterile blue light, the hum of superconductors vibrating through the floor as the countdown began. Vance stood in the control room, flanked by her top engineers, Dr. Jules Harrow, the team's lead biologist, and Hendrik Lau, head of security. The reactor, a monolithic ring of exotic metals and plasma coils, loomed beyond the reinforced glass, its heart pulsating as containment fields stabilized the breach. Final diagnostics clear, Harrow reported, scanning the screens. Energy retention at 76%, structural integrity stable, no particle deviations. Vance exhaled, gripping the railing. This was it, the moment of truth. Engage the rift, she commanded, a single keystroke. The reactor lurched, sending a deep, resonant pulse through the facility. The air itself thickened, charged with a static that made their teeth vibrate. The sensors screamed, power levels spiking to numbers beyond theoretical limits. And then, just as suddenly, everything leveled out. The breach was open. The rift wasn't a portal in the conventional sense. There was no visible tear in space, no gaping hole into another world. It was more like a distortion, a place where reality folded inward, condensing into something denser than space itself. The energy readings were astonishing, enough power to sustain entire continents for centuries, and yet something about it felt wrong. The vibrations didn't stop. A low-frequency hum settled into the walls, into the very bones of the structure. It was barely audible, just on the edge of perception, but it was there, like a presence. Then the first anomaly appeared. A technician, Collins, staggered away from his workstation, clutching his stomach. His breathing turned ragged, his face pale. He choked, gagging. Then he vomited a lump of flesh onto the floor. Silence. The mass twitched, Vance stepped forward, but Harrow was already there, crouching beside it. He pulled a scalpel from his belt, prodding the tissue. It was warm, pulsing as though it had its own circulatory system. The texture was something between flesh and cartilage, the outer membrane shifting in color, adapting to the room's lighting. "What the hell is this?" Lau muttered, stepping back. Harrow was about to answer when Collins screamed. His veins had darkened, spreading like ink beneath his skin. His body convulsed, his muscles spasming in unnatural ways, as if something inside him was trying to rearrange itself. And then it stopped. Collins went still, his breathing stabilizing. His skin returned to normal, the black veins fading. He looked around, confused. I'm fine," he stammered, wiping his mouth. "It's gone. I don't feel anything." Vance exchanged a glance with Harrow. This wasn't possible. There had been no biological contaminants reported. No radiation leaks, no exposure risks. Nothing should be happening to the human body. Still, she forced herself to stay calm. Get him to medical. Full diagnostic. As Collins was led away, Vance turned her attention back to the rift. The energy readings were still stable, but the low hum in the walls had grown. She could feel it in her chest now. Something had changed. 2 hours later, Collins was dead. They found him in the medical bay, his body contorted, his jaw unhinged in an expression of pure agony. His chest had collapsed inward, as though his ribcage had been devoured from the inside. His skin had taken on a different texture, thicker, more elastic, and his blood had congealed into a fibrous black mass, like the lump he had expelled earlier. Harrow ran every test he could. Nothing made sense. Collins had no sign of infection, no foreign organisms in his bloodstream. His DNA remained human, but something inside him had been restructured at the cellular level. Vance ordered an immediate shutdown of the rift. The rift did not shut down. Every failsafe, every emergency override, every kill switch failed. The breach remained open, its pulse matching the vibrations that now echoed through the facility like a second heartbeat. Then the lights flickered, and for the briefest second, just before the emergency systems re-engaged, Vance swore she saw something move in the shadows. Not in the corridors, inside the walls. The emergency lockdown sealed the lower levels of the Arclight facility, but it did little to stop what was already happening. The rift remained open. Dr. Lenora Vance barely left the control room, her gaze fixed on the monitors cycling through each sector of the station. They had lost Collins first, but others were starting to exhibit similar symptoms: muscle tremors, unexplained rashes, involuntary convulsions. The medical wing was filling up with personnel reporting deep internal pains, the kind that left them curled on the floor, clutching their stomachs. Then there were the noises. The first reports came from Sub-Level 3, where the reactor's coolant lines ran through the thickest part of the station. The technician stationed there described scratching, something moving within the walls, too deep to be rats, too deliberate to be structural shifts. Security Chief Hendrik Lau took a team down to investigate. They found nothing but condensation-covered bulkheads and the endless, insidious hum that now seemed woven into the very bones of the station. When they returned, they brought back something worse. A body. Not Collins, not anyone they recognized. It was twisted, its proportions stretched in unnatural ways, as if it had been pulled apart and reshaped by invisible hands. The skin was pale, almost translucent, its veins pulsing with a dark, fibrous substance that coiled through the muscles like invasive roots. The eyes were still intact, but the mouth had split open, stretching far beyond human limits, revealing teeth embedded in layers of shifting flesh. Vance stared at it, nausea curling in her stomach. Who the hell is this? No one answered, because no one knew. It wasn't one of them. Harrow crouched beside the body, gloved hands tracing the deformed musculature, feeling the elasticity of the tissue. His face was pale, his breath uneven. "This isn't just decay," he murmured. This body didn't decompose. It was restructured. Lau stiffened, fingers tightening on the grip of his rifle. Restructured into what? Harrow hesitated. Then, in the dim, flickering light of the lab, he peeled back a section of the corpse's abdomen, and the thing reacted. A shudder passed through the body, a ripple of movement that ran along the exposed flesh as though it was trying to reshape itself again. Harrow recoiled. Then, in the silence that followed, they heard it, a wet, dragging noise coming from the air vents above. The security team raised their weapons, scanning the room. The sound moved, shifting from vent to vent, something slithering through the ducts, its bulk pushing against the metal as it moved. Then it stopped. For a long, terrible moment, there was nothing. Then one of the ceiling panels buckled. The thing fell through. It didn't hit the ground, it caught itself on the walls, its mass expanding as it unfolded. There was no clear shape to it, just a shifting configuration of bone, flesh, and sinew, something caught between states, as though it hadn't yet decided what form it wanted to take. Then, in the center of its amorphous body, a mouth split open. Not a human mouth, something wider, layered with shifting rows of mismatched teeth. It was Lau who reacted first. He fired, the sharp crack of the rifle shattering the silence. The rounds struck the creature and sank in without resistance. The flesh absorbed the impact, shuddering as though it was learning, adapting. Then it moved, not forward, not backward. It collapsed into itself, folding into a new shape, something faster, something sharper. The second time Lau fired, it dodged the bullet before he even pulled the trigger. Then it was on him. Vance saw it tear through his body like wet paper, the flesh folding around him, the bones splitting at unnatural angles. His scream lasted only half a second before it was muffled, absorbed into the shifting mass. And then, Lau's face emerged from within the creature's body. It wasn't just consuming them, it was using them. The lab exploded into chaos. Shots rang out, equipment shattered, and then the emergency lights flickered again. The room plunged into darkness for only a moment, but when the power returned, the thing was gone. All that remained was the blood-slicked floor and fragments of Lau's tactical vest. Vance didn't hesitate. "We evacuate now." Harrow grabbed her arm. "The rift's still open. We don't even know if we can leave." "We don't have a choice," she snapped. "If that thing came through, then there's no telling how many more are here." Harrow's face paled, because he already knew the answer. It wasn't just one. The scratching noises hadn't stopped. They had just gotten closer. The emergency klaxons howled through the halls of the Arc-Light facility, but there was no one left to hear them. Dr. Lenora Vance moved on instinct, sprinting through the dim corridors, her breath ragged in the stale air. The station had become a graveyard, the walls painted with the remains of those who hadn't escaped in time. The rift was still open, still pulsing in the reactor chamber, and something was spreading through the station like an infection. She had seen it with her own eyes. Lau was gone. Collins was gone. Half the personnel had either collapsed into twisted masses of flesh and bone, or worse, been reshaped into something unrecognizable. She didn't know how many were left. Harrow had managed to rally a small group, barricading themselves in the upper levels, but it wasn't going to last. The thing wasn't just in the walls anymore. It was learning. They heard it moving, slithering through the pipes, twisting through the ventilation shafts, reconfiguring itself to fit into whatever space it needed. The station was a perfect hunting ground. It could be anywhere. It could be anything. And it wanted them. Vance reached the security checkpoint leading to the command sector, her boots slipping on the floor. She didn't look down. She already knew what she had stepped in. She slammed her hand against the control panel. The bulkhead hissed, releasing the locks with a sluggish mechanical groan. Behind her, the corridor was silent. That was worse than the sound of pursuit. She stepped inside, the doors sliding shut with a final ominous clang. Harrow was waiting inside, his face pale, sweat-drenched. 3 others huddled near the far wall, technicians barely holding themselves together. One of them, Gale, was trembling violently, arms wrapped around her stomach, as if she was trying to hold herself inside her own skin. "How bad?" Vance asked, chest heaving. Harrow shook his head. "It's not stopping." He gestured toward the security monitors. The lower levels were unrecognizable, the walls no longer metal, but something else. Something with a texture that pulsed and shifted like muscle fibers. The station was being remade. Gale let out a sharp, ragged breath. I don't feel good." No one spoke. They all knew what that meant. Vance turned toward Harrow, lowering her voice. "We need to shut down the rift. Now." "It's not going to let us," Harrow muttered. "The containment fields are destabilizing. Every time we try to cut power, the readings spike higher. It's feeding off the energy." Vance clenched her jaw. "Then we destroy it." A low, wet sound filled the air. A shudder. A breath. They all turned toward the air vent above the consoles. The metal bulged outward, the screws rattling, the grate distorting. Something was inside. Then the panel popped free, landing on the floor with a dull clang. A limb slithered out. It was not human. At least, not anymore. It moved in a slow, calculated motion, feeling its way across the floor, its translucent skin stretched too thin over shifting muscle. Small teeth lined the ridges of its joints, flexing as it moved. Then another limb emerged, and another, and another. The shape pulled itself from the vent, unfolding into something grotesque, something shifting, something that had no true form at all. Vance's blood turned to ice. It was Lau, or what was left of him. His face was still there, half-formed, stretched across a shifting mass of sinew and bone. His eyes flickered open, not with recognition, but with hunger. Then it spoke. The voice was not Lau's anymore. It was a chorus, layered, fractured, as if the thing had absorbed more than just his flesh. "You opened the door." The sound of it made Vance stagger back. The others froze, too terrified to move. The Lau thing twitched, its limbs rippling, its shape unstable, as if it was still deciding what it wanted to be. It was adapting. Vance gritted her teeth and raised her weapon. "Harrow! Run!" Harrow didn't hesitate. He grabbed the technicians, shoving them toward the emergency hatch on the far end of the room. Gale was too slow. The Lau thing lunged. Vance fired. The bullets tore through it, but there was no blood, no wound, just flesh reknitting itself, shifting to mimic the damage, as if it was learning how to take the hits. Then it moved again, faster than before. It was too late for Gale. The creature folded around her, its body twisting into tendrils that burrowed beneath her skin. She didn't even have time to scream. Her form shuddered, convulsing, then settled, her arms dropping limp at her sides, her expression blank. Then she looked up. Vance saw her eyes change, not human anymore. The thing had taken her. Then she smiled, and her voice was no longer hers. "We are here now," Vance ran. The Arclight facility was dying. Dr. Lenora Vance could feel it in the tremors that shook the walls, in the flickering emergency lights, in the way the air itself seemed thicker, harder to breathe. The rift was no longer a controlled breach. It was a wound, torn too wide, festering. The creature had taken too much, and now it wanted everything. She sprinted through the collapsing corridors, the alarms a distant, meaningless wail in her ears. The halls were unrecognizable, flesh and steel fused together, a grotesque hybrid of organic and mechanical, pulsing like a living organ. The station had become part of it. Behind her, Harrow ran at full speed, his breath ragged, his face slick with sweat. They had lost the others. Gale was gone. The last technician had been pulled screaming into the dark, his body split apart mid-sentence, his skull disappearing into the shifting walls. It was just the two of them now, and the thing was everywhere. A wet chittering filled the air vents above, accompanied by the sound of bones scraping against metal. Vance could hear her name in the noise, fragmented voices, layered and broken. They were calling for her. She didn't stop. She couldn't. Ahead, the reactor chamber loomed, the rift still gaping open, a swirling, impossible darkness at its center. The energy was unstable, the containment field barely holding together. If they didn't shut it down now, the station wouldn't just collapse, it would become a gateway. And then this thing wouldn't be contained here anymore. Vance skidded to a stop at the reactor control panel, fingers flying over the keys. "I'm setting an overload," she panted. "We'll trigger a containment implosion, bury the rift with the facility." Harrow hesitated. "Will that work?" She looked up at him. He already knew the answer. Harrow exhaled sharply, wiping the sweat from his face. "Then let's end this." The reactor groaned as the override sequence initiated. The power core surged, the rift convulsing, reacting to the sudden energy spike. The ground lurched, metal plates buckling beneath their feet. And then they heard it, a wet, dragging sound coming from the entrance. The creature was here. It emerged from the shadows, its form unfolding, shifting, a grotesque collection of limbs, torsos, and faces, dozens of them, stitched together in an ever-changing mass. Lau's face was still there, but it was wrong, stretched too wide, smiling too much, eyes black and empty. Gale's arms protruded from its side, her hands still twitching. And deeper inside, buried within the shifting tissue, Vance swore she saw herself. A face that looked like hers but wasn't. A mouth that was forming her name. "You brought us here." Harrow fired his last rounds. The bullets sank into the mass, but it didn't flinch. It was past the point of reacting to wounds. It was evolving beyond them. It lunged. Harrow shoved Vance aside, taking the brunt of the impact. The force lifted him off his feet, his body vanishing into the writhing mass. Vance hit the floor hard, pain exploding up her spine. She heard Harrow scream. Then, silence. She forced herself up, stumbling toward the controls. The overload sequence was almost complete. 10 seconds. The creature twisted toward her, something vaguely resembling a head forming from its mass. She reached for the detonator. A tendril lashed out. It wrapped around her wrist, yanking her forward. For the first time, she felt it, the texture of it, the way it was alive, its flesh not just absorbing but rewriting. Vance gasped as her skin began to change. The thing was pulling her in, fibers unraveling beneath her fingertips, her veins turning black, merging with it. The rift pulsed. Her own reflection flickered in the dark, staring back at her from the breach. It wasn't just a wound anymore. It was a mirror. And the thing inside was looking at her. The countdown reached 0. Vance slammed the detonator. A sound like tearing reality filled the air, a deafening rupture that sent shockwaves through her skull. The station groaned, the rift collapsing inward. The creature screamed. It split apart, unraveling into its composite pieces, each face shrieking, each limb clawing at the collapsing space. The walls imploded, the reactor core surging beyond critical limits. Everything folded inward, and then silence. When the Arctic ice finally settled, there was no sign the Arclight facility had ever existed. The station was gone. The rift was gone. The world continued, unaware of how close it had come to being rewritten. But beneath the ice, deep, deep below the frozen ocean floor, something still breathed. It had learned, it had adapted, and it was waiting.